I've talked about these two options that the government has for like managing externalities: controlled consumption or tax consumption. Okay, question is, which one should we do? Okay, I'm going to give you all a minute to admire my artwork here. Okay, you've admired it. Let's suppose there's some good causing an externality. I wrote alcohol on the slides, but that was more a gimmick. If I publish the slides, I don't want to hear people, or I don't want people to think I was really talking about heroin or marijuana. But really, those are the things that I am kind of thinking about. Remember those illicit drugs that we talked about on Tuesday? Right? I think I brought this up, right? Drugs, the fun kind of drugs that we're not allowed to buy. Okay, like what? Examples are, have you all heard of any? I mean, I just named a couple. Heroin is an example. Meth. Okay. What else? Cocaine. Okay. Are there any others? Acid. Okay. LSD. Okay. You'll have heard of some of these, right? And the government regulates them. I probably said this on Tuesday. The strongest arguments for government intervention in a market, like a market for heroin, meth, cocaine, LSD, the government interferes in those markets, right? And an economist would say intervention in a market can improve outcomes if there's a problem with information, if there's a problem with market power, or if there's a problem with externalities. Okay, let's suppose perhaps it's an issue with externalities. We're concerned about problems of, say, heroin addiction for society. Okay? Now, the externality is not the damage that a person causes to themselves. It's the damage that they cause to other people. Okay? And perhaps it is difficult for a family when, dad's addicted to heroin, or mom is on crack, or something like that. Okay, so the government says, listen, you're doing too much damage to the kids. We don't want that behavior. So the government has its two options for how to cut back on behavior that causes externalities. One is control. Okay, so here's my market for the good, alcohol or whatever good is causing the externality. There's some demand for the good, there's some supply of the good. And if the market were left to itself, there would be an equilibrium price, P star, where the quantity consumed is Q star. Okay. But if consuming this substance causes negative externalities, Q star is more than what is socially optimal. Okay, so maybe the government assesses this and realizes that the optimal quantity to consume, is Q hat. Okay? Remember, I said that the hat on some letter, some variable, will usually stand for what is socially optimal. Okay? It is socially optimal for people to consume less heroin, meth, alcohol, marijuana, whatever. So the government has decided that, and let's just assume the government is correct about that Q hat is the socially optimal quantity to consume. Okay. Well, let me point out, if we cut back consumption to Q hat, people will, just in general, if Q hat is the amount consumed, the price that people are willing to pay for Q hat, that consumers are willing to pay for Q hat, is determined by the supply curve. Demand curve. So the demand curve says that at this particular price, I think I'll call it P prime, at a price of P prime, quantity demanded would be Q hat. Okay? So, a couple of things. Just a second. Okay, so if the government were to restrict output, this is a situation that we talked about early in market analysis. What happens when there's a quota on output? The price in the market will go to what the demand curve will support. Okay, the price is determined entirely by the demand curve. Okay, so if we cut back consumption, it's going to drive up the price. Okay, if we limit how much cocaine people can consume, there's kind of a shortage of cocaine, people will bid up the price. Okay? And that's what goes on. The price in equilibrium would have been this point right here, P star, right? Across from the market equilibrium. However, the quota drives the price up. Okay? Now, the alternative strategy for the government would be to recognize, hey, what if, let me take a step back. Okay, this is, of course, what happens when things are illegal. I mean, in North Carolina, it is not legal to purchase marijuana. In other states like Colorado, it is. Okay, because there are restrictions on purchasing marijuana in North Carolina, it drives up the price. Okay, I'm not sure. I'm not even going to ask if anyone's been in the market for marijuana in any state recently, but I think in North Carolina, the market price of an ounce of weed is somewhere around $400 $500, depending on the quality. The same stuff, maybe even higher quality, in Colorado would be $200 to $300. Okay, so it's about a $200 premium, because the government restricts consumption in North Carolina. Okay, so anyhow, the alternative approach to controlling the quantity, like making something illegal, is the ultimate quantity control. But an alternative would be to manipulate the price. In fact, if the government could set the price at P prime, then that would encourage or that would cause consumers to select consuming the point that comes down from the demand curve, but that's Q hat. Okay? So suppose that, say, the equilibrium price of an ounce of marijuana is $300. Okay? But in North Carolina, because it's been made illegal, or the quantity is substantially restricted by laws, that forces the price up to $500. What the government could do instead is to tax an ounce of marijuana at $200, and that brings the price up to $500. And once the price is at $500, consumers voluntarily cut back how much they purchase. Does that make sense? Yeah. So if the government can set the price at P prime, then it can get consumers to purchase Q hat. Okay, how does the government set the price? By adding on a tax. Okay, so here's my illustration of what the government can do. The optimal strategy for the government is to set the per unit tax, okay, equal to the difference between the demand curve and the supply curve at the socially optimal quantity. Okay, so this is like setting a $200 an ounce tax on marijuana. And then there will be two different prices in the market. There will be the price to the seller. So seller gets the price without the tax. There's a different price to the consumer, which is the price with the tax. Okay? And the difference between these two prices is the amount of the tax. Okay. Follow? All right. So let's talk about an important thing, surplus. Okay? First, I've established the government can get to whatever quantity it wants through a tax. Okay? Instead of setting a law saying we're restricting the quantity, the government can say we're not going to restrict quantity, we're just going to tax. And set a tax so high that it cuts back consumption to that quantity. Okay, so the government could do either thing. So let's compare surplus in the two scenarios. If there's a price control, I'm sorry, no, I apologize, not price control, a quantity control, it drives the price up to P prime. Consumer surplus is everything below the demand curve down to the price that consumers pay as far out as the quantity that consumers consume. Okay, so it's this orange triangle up here. Producer surplus is the area below the price that producers receive down to the supply curve as far out as the quantity sold. Okay, so it's this blue area. That represents essentially profits. Here's something that I'm going to point out is that this is profitable for sellers. Controlling the quantity is profitable for sellers. Now, and imagine your stereotype of rich drug dealers. They get rich from the higher price. Okay? That's why this blue area is so big. Now compare that with the strategy of taxing. Consumer surplus is everything below the demand curve down to the price that consumers pay. But this tax, the optimal tax, would set the price consumers pay equal to the price they would be paying anyhow in a controlled market. Okay? So again, like the strategy is to tax marijuana up until the price is $500 an ounce. Okay, which is the same that it is in the market when it's controlled. Okay, but then sellers don't get all of the money when a person purchases marijuana or whatever substance. Okay, That's the big difference between controlling quantities directly and taxing. The sellers don't get all that money. There's the price that the sellers receive, which does not include the tax. So the surplus to sellers is everything below the price that sellers pay, down to the supply curve, out to the quantity that's sold. In between, that red rectangle, that's tax revenue generated by this good. Okay, tax revenue is the quantity sold just to remind you all, it would be the quantity sold times the per unit tax. The quantity sold is Q hat, and the difference between the price paid by consumers and the price received by sellers, that's the per unit tax. Okay, this red rectangle has a height equal to the per unit tax and a width equal to the amount consumed. So that area is Q hat times the per unit tax. It's the same as the calculation of tax revenue. Okay, so go back and compare this to, so I'm going to flip to the slide that shows market where quantity is controlled. Here are the areas of surplus. Okay? Consumer surplus is the same with either strategy. Either taxing or controlling, consumer surplus remains the same. Consumers pay a high price and they consume a low quantity. When the quantity is restricted, all of this area in blue is producer surplus. Think of that as profit to the sellers. Flip back to the market with a tax, a good chunk of that area of producer surplus turns into tax revenue instead of profit to the sellers. Okay, so here's the thing. Here's sort of the moral of the story. Either a control on quantity or a tax can reduce consumption. Okay. The tax generates government revenue. Okay. The control on the quantity gives profit to sellers. Okay. And those two quantities are the same. I mean, basically, all the money, all the tax revenue that the government could have collected instead goes to the sellers as profit. Okay. On top of that, there are a couple of things I'll mention. I mean, but you know, the main point is controlling the quantity, like restricting consumption, even passing laws to make something illegal, only make the business profitable for sellers, for drug dealers. Do we want a law that makes drug dealers profitable, gives money to drug dealers, or a law that gives the equivalent amount to a law that does the same job of restricting consumption, but instead generates tax revenue? I think the answer is most people would prefer to have tax revenue instead of making drug dealers rich. Okay, Additionally, controlling has a cost. I mean, going specifically to the war on drugs, it's expensive for the government to control consumption of drugs. And, and it's sort of ironic that drug control policies or consumption control policies make sellers rich and force the government to fund the police to cut down on sellers who are like able to finance the sellers can finance their end of the war on drugs with the profits they get from selling drugs at high prices. Well, if if the if there were no restrictions on consumption and instead there's a strategy of taxing drugs, the government would get more revenue. The drug dealers would not. They would not be battling law enforcement, and they would not have the money to amass weapons to fight law enforcement. So, a second problem with controlling is this cost to the government. Okay, so I think most economists would say that um, like taxing is hands down better than trying to control consumption. With yeah.
I just have this really quick question. So, how, I don't know if this makes sense, but how by reducing consumption does it benefit the sellers?
Okay, cutting back the quantity that can be sold drives up the price.
Oh, okay.
And that results in profit to sellers. I mean, the high price of illicit drugs, it does not reflect the high cost of producing them. It reflects the fact that the government has made these things scarce. And when they are scarce, people there are a handful of people who are willing to pay a lot for that tab of acid or um, uh, ecstasy or whatever it is. Um, and so it drives up the price, and that's profitable to the sellers. Okay, and again, we could accomplish the same thing if instead of controlling quantity, we just simply raise the price, which causes people to voluntarily purchase less because it's so expensive. Um, if the price of a tablet of ecstasy is, how much does it sell for? Okay, $20. Okay, sure. Let's pretend that's the market price. Um, I mean, if that's the price when the drug is illegal, it might be considerably more than the cost of production, which might be in the neighborhood of $1 a tablet. Okay, but okay, at the high price of $20, again, being illegal forces the price up. There are still some people who are willing to pay that, on occasion to enjoy the substance. There will always be people who this is my sense of any vice. There are always going to be people who want to do it. Okay, there's if it's something fun, there are some people who are willing to do it at whatever price, at some price. And we could be talking about alcohol, we could be talking about drugs, we could be talking about prostitution, we could be talking about gambling. There will be people who want to do these things, and the government will never successfully eliminate the behavior, but the government forces the behavior underground. In fact, I should have brought that up. Additional thing is no ability to regulate. Okay. For example, safety. Okay. When when there's a prohibition on consuming something, the government can't regulate the safety of it. This was a problem during Prohibition, for example, when alcohol still got produced, except it got produced underground, by moonshiners, bootleggers. But there's no way for the government to inspect and control the quality of those illegal products. The same for recreational drugs that are illegal. You don't know necessarily what you're buying. That's a message that's been hammered into your heads, probably. You don't really know that what you're buying is what it's supposed to be. If we made it legal, the government can inspect quality and ensure that what is being sold is, in fact, what's really being sold. Okay, but again, if the government, well, there will always be people who are willing to pay some price, maybe a high price, to engage in whatever vice, whatever fun activity it is. So instead of making it illegal, the government could just tax to bring the price up. It generates money for the government, as I said. The government doesn't have to pay so much to fight the crime, right? I mentioned prostitution as another example. If the government made prostitution legal and um, made prostitution legal but taxed it, then it wouldn't have to spend money on fighting crime or fighting prostitution. In addition, it would be a safer job. Well, it would be a safer transaction for both the workers, who can legally go and complain if they were injured or something like that, right? It's not an option when the activity is illegal. It's harder for them to go to the police if there's a problem. And it's also something that the government could control health, require health inspections. Okay, so there are all these advantages to a policy of making something legal and tax it. Sound good? Okay. So that's really the moral of the story. Now, those are government options for intervening in externalities. There are private solutions as well. Okay, so what should we do about, or what can we do without the government to reduce negative externalities or encourage positive externalities? Okay, one is to try to teach people social norms. What is acceptable behavior? What is unacceptable behavior? Okay, like littering. Okay, if I'm driving down a stretch of road that I'm never going to drive on again, there's no one else around me, and I have some trash in my car, it is completely rational for me just to roll down the window and chuck that trash out the window. It disposes of the trash very easily, bless you. It disposes of the trash easily. Yeah, it creates an externality. Other people going down the road have to look at my garbage. Um, but but that shouldn't bother me. However, we've all had it pounded into our heads that we should not litter. Littering is bad behavior. Okay? It's rational, but we've been taught don't do this behavior that causes negative externality. Um, you know, sneezing. As who just sneezed, snoozed? Um, Remind me, you're Kaylee Rogers. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, what do you do after you sneeze? What are you supposed to do? Even pre-pandemic, you were supposed to, yeah, sneeze into your elbow. Why? You get all that slime in your elbow. For you personally, it's much easier and cleaner just to sneeze out in front of, like straight out in front of you. Um, but we've been taught that because it creates a negative externality, getting that, spittle and snot on other people, yeah, that's negative externality. We've been taught don't do that. Okay, so we can teach people to do things that are polite and don't do things that are rude. Okay, so a matter of social norms. Teach people that it's good to recycle. And it's okay. A second solution is maybe relying on charities or letting charities solve some of the problems of externalities. Let private organizations do things that create positive externalities. Okay. So, you know, feeding the poor or providing housing to poor people might create a positive externality for the public in general. Getting homeless people into houses is a public good. Okay. Well, the government could try to subsidize building homes for people who can't afford them. Um, in fact, the government does have housing subsidies. What are these called? Section 8, I think. Housing is subsidized housing for people who couldn't otherwise afford housing. Okay, that's a government solution. But private charities can do things that cause positive externalities. Okay, and when I'm talking about building homes for people who can't afford them, what private charity comes to mind? Yeah, Habitat for Humanity, right? Um, you know, okay, um, okay, feeding people. Of course, the government tries to ensure that people don't go hungry with a couple of programs like food stamps. Um, a big program to ensure that children don't go hungry are school meals. Um, but again, those are government um, programs. Do private charities provide similar services? Yeah, food kitchens, soup kitchens exist, run by private charities to do the same type of thing. Uh, let's see. Oh, you all know that the one example that's kind of near and dear to me, fire protection. Okay. And I've said private markets for fire protection are likely to be unsuccessful because people don't take into account the benefit of the benefit to their neighbors of purchasing fire protection. So, the government could step in and require everyone to purchase fire protection. Kind of does that through property taxes, I suppose. But um, my fire company and many of the rural fire departments in North Carolina are actually not for profit uh, uh, fire companies. So it's a strange arrangement. The rural fire departments are often set up as nonprofits. It started as our fire department started in 1972 when the farmers out in the country said, gee, it sucks that we have no fire protection out here in the country. Let's get together and start a group who's going to be the local fire brigade, and we're going to go and purchase a truck for hauling water and buy some fire hoses and buy a pumper engine. And they set themselves up as a private organization with volunteer members. They collected private donations, and as a private charity, they did the firefighting. Things have evolved from there, but still technically, it is a private charity organization. that the county contracts to fight fires. So the county pays this charity group, this charity organization, to fight fires in a particular fire district. So, like, now it's sort of complicated, but technically it is not a fire department because it's not a part of any government agency. It is a private company. And it's a distinction that like most people don't get, though you will sometimes hear different terminologies used. A firefighting group will refer to itself as a fire company instead of a fire department. But many fire companies do call themselves fire departments because that's the generic term. Okay, but again, started as a private charity. Okay, other solutions. Property rights. Okay, property rights are an important idea. The problem of externalities is maybe entirely an issue of unclear or poorly defined property rights. Okay, property rights is a general term that doesn't refer to like land property in particular. It's a general term for who has the right to do what with a resource. Um, okay, and again, problems with externalities arise when property rights are not clearly defined. Here's maybe an example. Okay, airplanes. Back in the pre-COVID days, people would fly around on these big metal tubes, and the big metal tubes would be packed full of passengers, and the seats would be really close together, and there'd be like little room between the rows. And here's the problem: reclining seats. Okay, reclining a seat is nice for the person sitting in that seat, but it smashes into the knees of the person behind. Okay, especially if the person behind has long legs. Like it just drives me nuts when someone leans back and has their seat pressing against my knees. It's painful for the whole flight. And I know. Do you all understand this problem? Okay, and you know that some people have very strong opinions opposing um, reclining seats. Nolan, I hate to pick on you simply because of your body type, but you probably have this problem. Yeah. Um, it's just uncomfortable. And okay, so there's an externality associated with leaning the seat back, and people even get into fights on airplanes about put your damn seat up. You're hurting me. Okay, this would all be easy to solve if it were clear. Passengers have a right not to have their knees smashed unless they get the permission. So in other words, a person needs permission to recline their seat, permission from the person behind to recline the seat, or if it's clarified that the people have the right to recline their seat, and if that bothers you, you need to do something else. Okay, pay for a better seat, sit in the emergency row, um, hell, even offer to pay the person in front of you money to prevent them from reclining their seat or make them voluntarily not recline their seat. Okay, the real problems with externalities come up when the property rights are not clearly defined. Like air pollution. do I have a right to put pollutants into the air, or do you have the right to breathe clean air? Okay? Externalities kind of are a problem because it's not clear that either side has a right to one thing or the other. Or pollution. And again, the real concern is environmental pollution, because the environment doesn't really belong to anyone, but we all use it. It and there's a difference between, say, littering in the general environment, like dumping pollutants into a publicly owned river. That causes an externality, and it causes externalities. The pollution is not good, but it's not clear that it is wrong unless the law prevents it. I mean, really, the struggles are when there's nothing that defines who owns that river and who owns the right to do whatever with the river. This is different from, like, you and your neighbor have your own properties, and your neighbor pours some dirty chemicals into a pond or a swimming pool on your property. That pond or swimming pool on your property is clearly yours, and they do not have the right to dump pollutants into it. So defining property rights clearly and allowing for the legal system, property rights, plus, like, the legal system, penalties, could solve all externality problems. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. This idea of the Coase theorem. Um, okay, but sue people for damages. Okay, the nice thing about defining property rights and allowing people to sue for damages is it prevents damages from happening. Okay, you don't actually have to sue your neighbor when your neighbor pollutes your pond, because your neighbor doesn't pollute your pond, knowing that they can be sued for it. Okay, right? And this is the idea behind tort, is what it's called in law, suing people for damages. Okay, now actually it becomes even more interesting. Tort law, I mean, you can sue someone, again, for injuring your property, injuring you, for the amount of the damage caused. Well, what if, in fact, hypothetically, your neighbor just really, really needed to get rid of some pollutants? It was very important to get rid of those pollutants very fast, and there was high value in polluting your pond at that time. Well, you can sue to recover the damages that were caused to you. And it might still be a win for both of you if your neighbor had a high value of polluting and you get compensated for the damage. That can in fact be a win for both of you. Okay, but again, like, if we simply define property rights, then people will internalize any damage that they cause to other people. That's the idea of suing someone for damage. And again, it causes people to internalize the externality. Okay, and knowing that you could be sued for damages when you cause them, change your decision. In most cases, you don't create externalities. Okay, so The next thing that I wanted to talk about was still along the idea of property rights. It's something that economists call the Coase theorem. Okay, and the Coase theorem is essentially the idea that if two things are true, if property rights are defined and if people are able to negotiate payments, then the externality problem is solved. The externality problem will be solved. Okay, now I have kind of a dated example, out of date example that illustrates the Coase theorem at work. So the TV show Sex and the City. Okay, y'all are kind of aware of this. It was popular, say 2000-ish, but I think it's retained or there's been a resurgence in its popularity. Okay, the original Sex and the City, the main character was this young woman named Carrie Bradshaw. She had kind of an on and off boyfriend who was very rich. Does anyone know this? Who's her boyfriend? Mr. Okay, very good. Okay, so we have experts here. Okay, for bonus points, who is Mr. Big patterned after? Wealthy real estate developer in New York around 2000, late 90s, 2000. Yeah. Okay. He's very very much at the time was recognizable as someone like Donald Trump. Anyhow, Mr. Big is very wealthy and he likes to get his way. And there's an episode where Carrie and Mr. Big go out to dinner in a restaurant. And after dinner, Mr. Big pulls out a cigar and starts to light it up. And the waiter comes and says, "Excuse me, sir, this is a no smoking restaurant." And, okay, Mr. Big at that point turns to all the other tables in the restaurant and is like, "If I give you all each $50, are you okay with me smoking my cigar?" And the other tables say, "Sure, sure, sure." And he hands out the money, he lights his cigar, he gets his way. Okay. And everyone is happy with that outcome, right? The people who accepted the $50 are clearly being compensated enough to give up their right to clean air for as long as it takes to smoke his cigar. Okay, so here's an example where property rights to clean air were clearly defined. Rights were in favor of the restaurant patrons to have clean air. But there was, in this case, the ability to transfer the property right in exchange for money. And the two parties, the smoker and the other people around, could negotiate and agree to a payment in exchange for the benefit. Presumably, that worked to the favor of everyone, right? It was worth all those $50 bills to Mr. Big to be allowed to smoke in the restaurant. And for all the patrons, receiving $50 was at least enough to compensate them for the damage. So even though the property rights were against smoking, that was actually not an efficient allocation of property rights because the value of smoking, like the social, if we think of society as a whole, there was one person who really, really, really wanted to smoke, and a handful of people who kind of disliked the smoking a little bit. Okay, it was not socially optimal to prohibit smoking in that case. And again, as long as they could negotiate selling the smoking rights, they could reach an efficient decision. Okay. So let me, oh, I already had that on a slide. Coase theorem, if the property rights are clear and we can negotiate trades, reach a socially optimal outcome through payments. Okay, so here's an example, noise pollution. Imagine you live in a dorm or an apartment and the person in the neighboring room or apartment likes being noisy, likes having loud, noisy parties. But you like peace and quiet. Okay. And so there's a conflict, right? You like peace and quiet. They like making noise. Peace and quiet has value to you. Noise has value to them. Now, the situation gets unpleasant if property rights are not clearly defined. If you feel that you have the right to peace and quiet and your neighbor feels they have a right to create noise pollution, that's where conflicts arise. Okay? But I bet if you live in a dorm, the property rights are more or less decided. Does your dorm have a quiet policy? Okay. So, for example, Nolan, you're nodding. What is the quiet policy?
Well, I'm running the dorm now, but I remember last year it was like 10 feet high, something like that.
Okay. Okay. So, okay. One answer, Stephanie? Okay. Okay. So Stephanie says quiet hours start at 11 on weeknights, 12 on weekends. Okay, Nolan remembers something similar but slightly different. Okay, so essentially this is a policy that says until 11 or 12 on weekends, people have the right to create noise pollution. But then after that time, the property rights are defined as people have a right to peace and quiet. Okay, that's sort of how I would describe it. Okay, now imagine the situation is that you value quiet, your neighbor values noise at $30. Now, what is socially optimal? Should we allow the noise or not allow the noise? Society will be happiest in this case if there's peace and quiet, correct? Okay, so that's what's socially optimal. Being quiet is socially optimal. Um, oh, quiet is socially optimal. Okay, so if, um, let's see, so if this is during noisy hours, it would seem that giving your neighbor the right to make noise would prevent us from having the socially optimal outcome. You really value peace and quiet. It's 10 o'clock, you're dead tired, you need to get up early tomorrow for a test, and your neighbor is still playing loud music, okay? You realize it's not quiet hours yet, but you really value your peace and quiet. The fact that they have the right to make noise should not prevent you from getting your peace and quiet. If you can go to your neighbor and say, listen, I will pay you $35 to be quiet. Okay, turn off your music. Okay, and your neighbor says, well, I wanted to make noise, but it was worth only $30 to me. You're offering me $35 to be quiet? Yeah, okay, I'd take that. So it's in the interest of your neighbor to accept that deal. You're out $35 that you had to bribe your neighbor to shut up or be quiet, but that's better than being out like $50 of that the noise would have harmed you, right? The unhappiness from the noise, like that caused $50 of damage. It's better just to pay your neighbor $35 to make it go away. So even if your neighbor has the right to make noise, if you can negotiate with your neighbor, you can bribe your neighbor or pay your neighbor to be quiet. Okay? There's potential for both of you to agree to it. If your value of quiet is greater than their value of noise, you can agree to a price, any price in between those would benefit both you and your neighbor. Okay, so even if your neighbor has the right to noise, we can come to the optimal decision. Okay, now if let's see, if this is during quiet hours and your neighbor wants to be noisy during quiet hours, of course the opposite is true. Your neighbor could come to you and try to bribe you and be like, hey, would you accept some money and let me play my loud music even after quiet hours? Again, assuming that people are allowed to trade, negotiate trades. Well, um, you know, if it's the case that you value quiet a lot and your neighbor likes noise but not so much, they would never be able to come up with enough money to like bribe you or pay you to permit the noise. Yes.
What if we complicate the situation by incorporating the idea of a third party, such as like an RA, who is kind of more in line with the rules of it and not willing to be negotiated with?
Okay. So the point you raise is what happens if there's someone else, and you're thinking specifically of an RA who doesn't permit this. Um, yeah, and what I said was the Coase theorem will work if people are allowed to trade these rights. Um, and you're saying, what if the RA prevents people from trading rights? And I'm saying, yeah, then the Coase theorem isn't going to work. It would be a good idea if your RA would say, listen, if the two of you are cool with this agreement, I'm not going to step in and enforce rules when both of you are okay with the agreement. Does it make sense to you how like it would be good for everyone if your RA would be cool with that instead of just like enforcing the rules arbitrarily?
Yeah, my only like question is, to that point, what if like you were also creating another negotiation with your RA?
Okay, what if you have to create another negotiation with your RA? And then we're getting into like multiple parties, and you might be like, okay, fine. I valued my peace and quiet at $50. Um, I can pay you $35 to my neighbor to be quiet. I can pay $5 to my RA to turn a blind eye to this. Um, you if there are multiple parties, it can still be negotiated. But you're picking up on exactly the challenges of using the Coase theorem. It can be hard when there's a large group of people to get them to come together and reach a consensus, right? I mean, if your neighbor wants to have a loud party during quiet hours, and it's really worth it to your neighbor to have that loud party. It's their birthday. They want to party like it's their birthday. Um, uh, in principle, they could come by and try to bribe each person who wants the quiet. Be like, I'll give you $20. I'll give you $15. I'll give you 10, and try to pay them off. It gets more difficult, especially because then it's like, but this is an all or nothing deal. You have to all agree to these payments, or else nobody gets anything. Then it becomes complicated. So there's this potentially a big if in when I set up the Coase theorem. If it's easy for groups to come together and trade, then the Coase theorem can solve the problem and reach the efficient way or the socially optimal way to provide the externality or not do the externality. Um, but yeah, you're picking up on the limitations are when there's a barrier to trade. or when it's hard for groups to come together to reach a consensus. You know, you can imagine a factory that wants to dump pollutants into the village water, or water that impacts a whole village. Um, and it might be the case that it's really beneficial to be able to dump those pollutants right here, right now. It does $1 million of damage to the townspeople, but it would cost $2 million to haul the pollution somewhere else. So there's room for agreement between the factory and the people. The factory says, hey guys, I'll give money to the whole town if you're okay with me polluting. But it's hard to get all the people to come together and reach a consensus. Yeah.
What if the town, instead of the company that's polluting, give them money, they instead give them the product for free? Would that be a same fair trade-off, or would those fair trade-offs that are not economically speaking happen in this?
Okay, trading the goods. So instead of receiving money, they receive a product for free. That would be the same idea, some type of compensation. And now, by the way, this example of that last example that I was talking about, there might be a conflict between a factory that would benefit from polluting or find it expensive to cut back on polluting, and a town that wants clean water. If the town has the right to a clean river, it can, like, the factory can still pay off the townspeople and get them to agree to it. I mean, in theory, right? That, like, this is a theoretical idea. But it also works if the people of the town do not have the right to clean water, and the factory has the right to dump its pollutants into the water. The people of the town could go to the factory and say, listen, we know that you get $2 million of benefit from dumping pollution into the water, or it would cost you $2 million to take your pollution somewhere else. But you're causing us a lot of damage. And it's even more than that benefit. So tell you what, even though you have the right to pollute our river, we will volunteer to pay for your toxins, your pollutants, to get shipped away to some other location. Um, and so, again, the Coase theorem will work as long as someone has the property rights. The resource will get used by whoever values it more. So polluting the river, or, well, the clean water will get used one way or the other. Okay, so does this kind of make sense? Okay, I mean, a problem with air pollution is, or, well, a way to solve problems of air pollution is, in theory, we could give all the air in the world to someone. And Kaylee, I'll pick on you. Well, Kaylee owns all the air in the world, and you have to pay Kaylee to pollute the air. Okay? But you can also pay Kaylee not to let the air be polluted. So, my factory, we want to put some nitrous oxide in the air, and we're like, hey Kaylee, it's your air, but how about we pay you $1,000? And Kaylee might not have her own interests in this, but we offer her that money, and then the other people around are like, whoa, 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 we don't like that idea. We'll put all our money together, and Kaylee, we will pay you $1,500 to keep the air clean. And then Kaylee makes this decision about, like, well, does she take the money from the polluting factory, or does she take money from the people who want to keep the air clean? Whoever values the air more, if my factory values pollution more than the people value their clean air, I will get my way. I will be able to pay more for the right to pollute than people would be willing to pay to keep the air clean. On the other hand, if people really value clean air, they'd be willing to pay Kaylee more to keep the air clean than I would be willing to pay to pollute the air. Okay? So if we were to define who has the right to determine whether the air gets polluted, we give someone the ownership of the air, it will result in an efficient decision. In other words, I wouldn't be putting a lot of pollution into the air, damaging lots of people, just to save my factory a little money. Just having someone in charge and able to accept payments could solve this problem. Okay? As I said, this is all sort of theoretically true. Okay, so I've got more slides talking through all the different scenarios, but I expect you all get the idea. Like, as long as rights are clearly defined one way or the other, we can reach an efficient decision, or society will reach an efficient decision. Okay. I'm sure the textbook will talk through the Coase theorem, and I'll put my slides online, and you all can see the different scenarios. Like, you value peace and quiet more than your neighbor, but your neighbor has a right to noise, or you value peace and quiet less than your neighbor, but you have a right to peace and quiet. Yeah.
Well, I'm just wondering, sorry, I'm a little
No.
confused, and I was wondering, like, is there a way that the negotiation, like, keeps happening as you progress through this, like, theory? Like, so if, like, your neighbor values, being noisy at $35 and you value it at $50, but they actually value it at more than that, and they tell you, oh, I really value it at $50 or at $60, and you say, okay, but I value it at, like, I don't know, $55, and keep that negotiation going, or does that cause the theory not to?
Okay. You could continue negotiating, but if you could continue negotiating, and there's a problem with information if people are not honest about what it's worth to them. Um, uh, I think, like, the basic thing is that you do want to be somewhat honest about how much you value the peace and quiet, and just both parties could say in the beginning, this is what peace and quiet is worth to me, this is what noise is worth to me, and we will agree on some price in between. Then you want to be honest about how much peace and quiet is worth to you, because if you try to set your price too high, you might not get it even though you would benefit from it. And so, I mean, so there are several things. I mean, the answer to your question, the complete answer to your question is long. And but I mean, it's a very good thing to raise. If you don't mind, what I'm going to say is the Coase theorem, as I'm presenting it here, is a very simple idea. The practice of how to implement it is challenging, okay? But economists suggest this is a good starting point for thinking about how to handle externalities, is just make it clear who has a right to do what, and then let them agree to transfer those property rights, okay? And so one kind of point that I might make is if you have this noise conflict with the person in the dorm room next to you, and your RA just says, hey, rules are rules, you can't do that, that's actually a bad thing for society to enforce a rule simply because it's a rule. That if your RA would say, listen, both of you agree to it, um, and then I'm cool with it, then you can reach an outcome that is socially optimal. I mean, it's just like thinking about this, like the benefit of just defining who has the right to do what, and having clearly defined like quiet hours certainly help with this problem. Um, Makes it much easier than just shouting at your neighbor, will you turn it down, and getting mad at each other. What would make it even better would be if we could exchange these rights. And so Ronald Coase is the economist who suggested this as a way to handle externalities in general. But as I'm saying, like, and you're picking up on this for certain, the practice of how to do that is complicated. Getting a group of people to come together and say how much something is worth to them um, can be challenging, and then negotiating a price can be challenging. So, um, and sometimes impossible. Right now, with carbon emissions, there's a conflict between the current generation's desire to put carbon into the air and the damage caused to the environment to future generations. Um, and we things would be easier if the current generations could sit down and talk to future generations and be like, listen, we really need to put this carbon in the air, and we will give you $1 trillion in cold hard cash to make up for the damage we're doing to your environment. And that future generation that hasn't yet been born says, okay, we're cool with that. Like, it can't happen. In theory, that would be a way of solving, like what Coase is pointing out is like that would be a way of solving externality problems, but in practice it can be challenging. Does that kind of make sense? Or like if it's the case that people today have the right to do as we like with the air and screw those future generations, which is kind of how I think most people feel property rights are allocated. Um, you know, Ideally, those future generations could sit down and say, listen, you're causing so much harm to us. We will pay for technology to cut back on carbon emissions. If we could do that, it would be great for both sides and we'd solve the problem of carbon emissions. The fact that those future generations haven't yet been born and the fact that we can't bring generations together to negotiate makes this impossible. Um, okay, so again, you're picking up on the limitations of the Coase theorem. Okay, I've got one more thing to talk about dealing with externalities, private solutions to externalities. This is the idea of integrating. Okay, so let me start this off. Hey, today y'all get 2 pictures in one lecture. Imagine there are 2 businesses that, 2 farms. One farm is a bee farm. Beekeeper keeps beehives. And beekeeper is wondering about whether to keep this business open. Beekeeper has been bringing in $80 of revenue from selling honey, but it's cost $100 to run this bee farm. So the beekeeper is like, I'm losing money. But remember, the other thing that honeybees do is they they pollinate, right? They fly around to neighboring flowers. They go to the neighbor's orchard. And so here's Kristen's apple orchard. You see those little things up here around the apples? Those are honeybees. They're flying around and they're getting nectar out of the flowers and drinking that nectar, well, bringing it back to their hive to turn into honey. But as they do that, they inadvertently pollinate the flowers. And Kristen gets more fruit because of that. So the bees bring Kristen $50 of extra fruit. So if we ask the question of, does society benefit from having the bees? The answer is yes. The bees produce $80 of honey plus an extra $50 of fruit. The bees produce 130, and the cost of keeping them is 100. So society gets more benefit than cost from these bees. But you understand Stephen's problem. Stephen is just one person and thinks of Stephen's business. He loses money. So he would shut down his apiary, his bee farm. Okay. People don't do enough of things that cause um, positive externalities. Now, a solution is what I describe as integration. Okay. What if Stephen and Kristen decide to merge their two farms and say, we're going to run this business together? Okay, here, the combined farm. Um, you know, there are the bees, same amount of honey produced, same cost. Then there's the fruit. Well, when they think about the profit to their collective farm, right, those from the bees bring $130 to their collective farm and cost their collective farm $100. It's profitable for them if they merge their business interests. Okay? And so this is, again, I'll list as a final way to that private people can solve problems of externalities if they merge their interests, integrate their businesses in this case, then the problem goes away. There's no externality anymore. It's all internal to just this one business. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, so that's officially